You heard what the vice president said yesterday, that actually Russia isn't nearly as bad as China is. Is he right?
Again, I haven't had access to all the intelligence he's citing about China, but I find it surprising. We know that Russia did extensive efforts to undermine the electoral process in this country and other countries. Yes, China's trying to promote positive views of China. It's at times using financial leverage if it gives money to certain types of nonprofit institutions. I do not see an across-the-board effort by China to subvert American democracy. But I think also the vice president's speech is part of a larger broadside, David. It didn't take place in a vacuum, as everyone watching this show knows, given the economic pressure we're putting on China. But just the other day, we slapped sanctions on China. Why? For buying arms from Russia. So this seems to me an effort to really, across the board, take the U.S. relationship with China and essentially really put the pressure on.
So as you suggest, there are at least two elements of this that are intermingled. One is democracy. It's the way we elect our president and our representatives here. The other is economic. And as I say, they tend to get intermingled. But on the economic front, yesterday Bloomberg had this report out that, in fact, apparently China is responsible for putting little chips in these motherboards that end up in computers being used by U.S. companies so they can gain access into there. Does that surprise you that China would be doing that?
Somewhat, only because it's such a brazen thing, if it all turns out to be true. The idea that they would risk so much of their commercial relationship with us, essentially what they've put into play is the entire idea of China as a central part of the supply chain. If we can't trust China to essentially not use that for intellectual property theft or intelligence purposes more broadly, that's going to really spur the movement here, which has already begun. Look at what we call the NAFTA talks, the U.S. Mexican-Canada agreement, to creating new supply chains that aren't as dependent upon non-American sources. In this case, I could see a real effort to silo American production more so China plays a less pivotal role.
So how realistic is that? I mean, how much of this is China assessing their position, particularly when it comes to things like microchips and things, that they really are a large player worldwide and that we couldn't go elsewhere? I mean, if we went elsewhere, where could we go?
That's a fair question. I'm actually going to China this weekend because that's one of the questions I have. Do they have a sense, and I'm not sure they do, of just how bad this relationship has turned? You know, people may disagree with President Trump's tariffs on China, but almost everybody, Democrat and Republican alike, agrees with his critique of China, that they have essentially used their participation in the World Trade Organization in ways that were never intended to their advantage. There's currency issues, how they've weakened the currency at time, obviously intellectual property theft, forced technology transfers. So we are seeing a pattern of behavior. And it's not clear to me the Chinese have taken on board that there's really a fundamental rethink going about the whole integration of China. And then the issue for us is, if we want to push them apart, if we want to have a less China-centric global economy, how viable is that? That's now a serious question for policymakers.
We had Max Baucus on a couple of days ago, someone you know well, former U.S. ambassador to Beijing, as well as former chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. And he likened this to an economic Cold War. In a world where now we've resolved things apparently with Canada and Mexico, we're working with Europe. Could we end up in some version of a Cold War like the way the United States was with the Soviet Union, with this U.S. China in economics?
Actually, I don't think it would be just economics. If you read the vice president's speech, I say, yes, there's the economic dimension, a much more frontal attack on Chinese internal treatment of its own people. And then we're also seeing greater concern about the South China Sea, where the United States maintains the right of free passage and overflight. And there's a sleeper issue out there, David, which is Taiwan. This is an issue that's never been resolved. The two countries have finessed it for essentially 4 decades. But we're beginning to see signs that the fabric of how we finessed it is beginning to fray. So I actually think it's possible not just an economic confrontation with China, but also a political and strategic confrontation in ways that, if you had me on the show 1 or 2 years ago, I would not have predicted. This relationship has deteriorated significantly in a short amount of time.
And Taiwan is something we don't focus on enough, unlike the South China Sea and those little, what do they call them? Those little islands, but they're not islands. But Taiwan is something, it's sort of a sleeping dog that we've let lie since almost the days of Kissinger.
Absolutely.
But we're now poking it again, not just the Chinese, but also the U.S. You're hearing some rhetoric coming out of this administration, much more confrontational on Taiwan.
Absolutely. A couple of years ago, when I was last in government, we used to be most worried that people on Taiwan would declare independence and foment a crisis. But what we're seeing now from the mainland is much less tolerance of anything that changes the status quo. And the United States is beginning to change the status quo. We've recently passed legislation encouraging officials to travel to Taiwan. And now we're looking at ways of penalizing countries that downgrade their relations with Taiwan under pressure from the mainland. So suddenly we're putting Taiwan in play. And based on the politics politics in Beijing and inside the mainland, I simply don't think there's any give on their part. No one's paying attention to this, but I would put it on the list of things that people should start worrying about.
So let's talk about resolving this potentially. And the first one in a more confrontational way. We had John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, yesterday, saying in response to the reports from Bloomberg that we need to have an approach that really has such deterrent effect that the Chinese would never think about doing this. Can we get in the cyber area to a world of mutual assured destruction that we used to have in the Cold War?
Short answer is no. The Cold War was bipolar, and we had what was called attribution. We knew who would shoot a nuclear weapon. They knew that we would know that. We could then retaliate against them. In cyberspace, we can't attribute things. We don't know who's doing things. And as a result, we can't threaten to retaliate. Often we cannot retaliate. Plus, there's so many players. This is not a bipolar world. This is a world of, if you will, billions of poles. This is far more difficult intellectually, but also in terms of policy. This is incomparably more difficult than the challenge we faced with nuclear weapons.
You said you're going over to China. I mean, you went to Northern Ireland, which is a pretty difficult set of problems. How do we, and by we I mean both the Chinese and the United States, climb back down off of this if we do?
Well, we've got to, because it's a very different 21st century. If the United States and China are at loggerheads, not just direct confrontation, we won't be able to deal with climate issues, trade issues, cyber issues, global disease issues. So it's really in both countries' interests. But that's the question of statecraft, of diplomacy, of foreign policy. Can we work it out? Won't be easy. Bad sign the other day when Secretary of Defense Mattis's trip was canceled. Good sign that the Secretary of State is going to be in China in a day or two. We have got to broaden and deepen this dialogue. Not enough for the president to be great friends with Xi Jinping. We have got to institutionalize serious talks about how the United States and China are going to deal with each other's domestic issues, with their bilateral relationship, with regional issues, with global issues. This has really got to be foreign policy priority number one.
So let's turn to one other geopolitical issue, which is Iran. The U.S. is really clamping down. New sanctions are going to take effect in early November. Already, oil exports from Iran are going down.
Way down.
How is this going to be resolved ultimately? I mean, this is really going to start hurting not just Iran, but the economy.
Well, it is hurting Iran. But one thing that's offsetting it somewhat, the Iranian budget, I'm told, set oil price at $55 a barrel. Oil prices already, in part because of the smaller output from Iran, are up to $85 a barrel. So I think it's quite possible, given higher prices, given what China might do, what India might do, what Russia may do, what Turkey might do, Iran will be able to muddle through these sanctions, and the United States is putting on.
To bring it full circle, what might China do? Because there are reports that India will go along with the sanctions. We haven't heard, I don't believe, from China yet. And given all the other conflicts, how critical is China? If China just starts saying, okay, we'll take your oil, thank you very much, Iran.
Well, they'll take some of it. My hunch is you could do it through barter. You can do it through the spot market. Look, the history of sanctions, no sanctions is watertight. Some of the Iranian oil will find their way to the market. My hunch is right now their output is probably at a low, and I would think over time it will go up somewhat. And the real question is, are the Iranians willing to muddle through, pay something of a price, or do they decide, which I think would be most radical but unlikely, to restart their nuclear program in some ways? That could elicit an American or Israeli response. Or do they also think about maybe putting some pressure on some of their neighbors? There's lots of things they could do in Yemen, in Saudi Arabia, in Syria, and so forth. Iran is not a country without tools. This is a country that has all sorts of tools to change what goes on in the Middle East or even the world. So we shouldn't assume they will simply take this down, absorb whatever pain we're going to inflict.
One of the ways the United States is making the sanctions so effective is by use of the financial system, basically saying to third parties, if you don't play with us on this, we're going to cut you off. Is that dangerous from the United States' points of view? Because if we do that too much, go too far, people will find out other ways of making payments.
Yeah, I think we're about to have a real-world experiment on this. The Europeans are looking at this special vehicle, a way of avoiding the dollar currency swap system. Maybe they could do something apart. My question is, given this isn't happening in isolation. We've got all the tariffs, all these other sanctions. We're looking at possibly new sanctions. To what extent is the world going to be willing to have a dollar-centric system, which is so obviously an instrument of American foreign policy? If we continue to weaponize the dollar, my guess is that the world will start to look for and begin to find ways of becoming less dollar-dependent. And we enjoy tremendous advantages, what one academic calls exorbitant privilege, for having the dollar be so central, particularly given our debt. We are in a very different strategic economic position if the world starts moving away from dollar-denominated interaction. We're not there yet, but it's just possible, David. We're beginning to set that process in train.